Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Student Vice President Leadership Summit. I'm Michelle Lowry Gussman. I just got married in April, so excuse me if I happen to go between both names. I have the pleasure of serving as your host for this year's summit. I work in the national office as a chapter development director, and I'm over the chapters that are in the Northeast, so from the bottom of the states all the way up to Maine. And in just a moment, I'll introduce our speaker. But I first want to tell you a little bit more about two things that I work with. So I serve as the liaison to student vice president, so that's all of you, and our council of students. So if at any time during your term as a student vice president you have questions, you can come to me or you can email any of the council members and we can address whatever questions you might have or concerns or issues. And one of the things to note about tonight's session, we do have a keynote address. And if you have any questions for the speaker, you can put those in the chat or you can wait until the end. So write down any questions you might have, and we're going to use the raise hand feature. So if you look down on your menu, you should see it under your reactions. So at any point you have a question after his presentation is over, I'm going to call for questions, and whoever raises their hand first, we're going to ask you to speak, unmute your mic and speak, and then we'll go to the next person, and so on and so forth. So today's session, like I said, our keynote address with Dr. Robert Mann. It's on truth and trust in leadership. So please keep your video on and your mic off. Dr. Robert Mann holds the Mannship Chair at the Mannship School of Mass Communication at Louisiana State University. He is the author of critically acclaimed political histories of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, American Wartime Dissent, and the 1964 presidential election. His most recent book was Becoming Ronald Reagan, The Rise of a Conservative Icon, the story of Reagan's political evolution in the 1950s and 1960s. Mann's essays and reviews have appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Politico, Salon, Vox, and Smithsonian Magazine. From 2013 to 2018, Mann wrote a weekly political column in the New Orleans Times-Picayune. In the early 1980s, he covered Louisiana politics as a reporter from the Shreveport Journal and the Monroe News Star. Before joining the LSU faculty in 2006, Mann spent more than 20 years in the political arena, working for 3 United States senators and a Louisiana governor. He was communications director to Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco after serving 19 years as a U.S. Senate aide. He was state director to U.S. Senator John Breaux of Louisiana and also served as Breaux's press secretary. He also served as press secretary to U.S. Senator Russell Long of Louisiana. He was press secretary for the 1990 re-election campaign of U.S. Senator J. Bennett Johnston of Louisiana, the 1992 and 1998 Breaux re-election campaigns, and the 2003 Blanco campaign. A memoir of his years in Louisiana politics called Backrooms and Bayous, My Life in Louisiana Politics will be published in the fall of 2021 by Pelican Publishing. In 2014, Mann was inducted into the Louisiana Political Hall of Fame. He is currently writing a book about Louisiana Governor and Senator Huey Long as his role in the building of the modern LSU. Please welcome Dr. Robert Mann.
Thank you, Michelle. It's wonderful to be with you all. One thing that Michelle didn't mention is that I'm speaking to you this evening from Jerusalem, where I'm on a trip with my wife and some other people, and so it's 2 a.m. here in Jerusalem in this hotel. So if I stumble in some way or the lights go out, you'll know why, because it's 2 a.m. in this hotel. But I'm delighted to be with you all, and hope that we'll have a good conversation after my presentation. When Michelle asked me to speak to you tonight, my first thought was, what could a college professor tell you all about leadership? As she mentioned, I'm a recovering journalist and politician who spent most of my life in working in campaigns and in government before taking a job teaching college students. What could I possibly say to a group like this would be meaningful or useful. So first of all, I admit, let's stipulate that my research is not about leadership methods or effective leadership in large organizations. But I did arrive at this insight that I spent many years in politics watching people lead or fail to lead. And I've devoted the last 20 years of my life writing about, well, really more than 20 years, writing about political leadership. And what I've learned about political leadership that I believe applies to in any capacity is this, and you're going to hear me say this a lot in the next 20 minutes or so. Conflict and truth aren't enemies, they're allies. And put another way, I want to talk tonight about dissent and how important dissent and creative conflict are to ethical and effective leadership. Some of you may have heard of this guy, Peter Drucker. Many people regard him as the greatest management scholar of the past century. And Drucker was fond of quoting the respected General Motors boss, Alfred Sloan. And one day, after hearing all of his vice presidents unanimously support a decision that he had made, Sloan told them, and this is the quote that Drucker used in his book, "I propose that we postpone further discussion of this matter until our next meeting to give us time to develop disagreement and perhaps gain some understanding about what the decision is." And Drucker said that his point was this. He said, most books on decision-making tell the reader first find the facts, but executives who make effective decisions know that one does not start with facts, one starts with opinions. Drucker said that it was important to understand that, and this is the quote, "the right decision grows out of the clash and conflict of divergent opinions and out of serious consideration of competing alternatives." In other words, conflict and truth aren't enemies, they're allies. Like all of you probably, I suspect, I'm a student and a fan of good, strong leadership. And like many fans, I think I can spot a good player. And also I can spot an ineffective player, a bad player. I think most of us are adept at this, whether we realize it or not. In Michelle's introduction, she mentioned that one of my books was about American wartime dissent, in which I examined various individuals over the course of 12 American wars who stood up to the government and society and declared their independence from popular opinion. Most of them were scorned. Some of them who were politicians lost their office. Several were tossed into jail. All of them paid some price for their dissent, for their opposition to war. But during my work on this book and afterwards, I began to think of dissent in a broader way, not just a general contrariness or stubbornness, not as just opposing something, but rather being brave enough to speak hard truths in a constructive way. And I came to embrace this idea. Conflict and truth are not enemies, they're allies. And conflict and truth, hard truths, are not merely worth tolerating. They should be respected, revered, encouraged, and nurtured. There's a passage from a wonderful book that was published in the late 1950s by the renowned British historian A.J.P. Taylor that had a lot of influence on me when I decided back in 2013 to become a vocal dissenter by starting a blog about Louisiana politics. And in that blog and in my column in the New Orleans paper that I wrote, I was very critical of our governor then, Bobby Jindal, my own board of supervisors, the LSU Board of Supervisors, and many others in politics in Louisiana. I had friends who told me that I was putting my career at risk, and I had a very prominent person in my school tell me that I was putting the school's funding at risk by speaking out and criticizing the governor. And they may have been right. Maybe I was too dumb to listen to them. But I want to read you a word or two from Taylor's book that he titled The Troublemakers, which I found so inspiring when I was launching my own campaign of dissent. This is what A.J.P. Taylor wrote. "Conformity may give you a quiet life. It may even bring you to a university chair. But all change in history, all advance, comes from the nonconformists. If there had been no troublemakers, no dissenters, we should still be living in caves." Over the years, I've also been influenced by the actions and words of a late U.S. senator from Arkansas. I don't know if anybody on this at this meeting tonight is from Arkansas, but Senator J. William Fulbright, former president of the University of Arkansas, who served in the U.S. Senate for several decades, had the courage and the vision to stand up to President Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s and oppose the Vietnam War when it was still very unpopular to do so. The war was still popular when Fulbright spoke out, and it cost him a lot. But Fulbright wrote this book, which still sits on my shelf in my LSU office back in Baton Rouge and is almost falling apart from constant use. It's called The Arrogance of Power. And on the very first page of the book, I have these words highlighted in pink, in bright pink. And he wrote, "In a democracy, dissent is an act of faith. Like medicine, the test of its value is not its taste, but its effect. Not how it makes people feel at the moment, but how it makes them feel and moves them to act in the long run." Senator Fulbright knew that dissent was unpopular because people did not understand its purpose or its value. He called speaking out the duty of dissent. But he also knew the dissenter must be ready to be attacked or worse, or really worse, ignored, because leaders generally do not like to be criticized. And Fulbright put it this way: "I'm reminded of Samuel Butler's observation that people in general are equally horrified at hearing the Christian religion doubted and at seeing it practiced." Strong leaders, of course, aren't threatened by dissent. Strong, confident leaders aren't threatened by dissent. They welcome it, they encourage it, because they recognize what it is: an excellent way to start a conversation, a useful conversation about the future, and involve others in improving the organization, involve others in the decision-making. I want to quote Peter Drucker again. He wrote, "Dissent, even conflict, is necessary, indeed desirable. Without dissent and conflict, there is no understanding, and without understanding, there are only wrong decisions." As I said earlier, Drucker was a great fan of Alfred Sloan, the General Motors chairman. And this is what Drucker wrote about Sloan. "To me, the most fascinating parts of Sloan's book, My Years with General Motors, are the memoranda in which he first elicits dissent and then synthesizes dissenting views into an understanding, and in the end, into consensus and commitment." What I want to suggest to you tonight is that I believe conflict, sometimes even uncivil behavior, can force a necessary but difficult conversation or a useful rethinking of our mission or our goals. Let me say it again: conflict and truth aren't enemies, they're allies. For one thing, conflict prompted by truth-telling gets people's attention because it's so rare. Let me tell you a story that I've heard since I was a kid. You may have heard some version of this story too. There's one day a man comes to a farmer to buy a mule, and he's heard that this farmer has the best mules in the county. And on this day, the farmer's working with the mule. He's speaking softly, and the mule is responding to everything that he tells it to do. The man is so impressed that he offers to buy the mule on the spot. And they agree on a price, and the man leaves with the mule. The farmer tells him, just speak softly to him and he'll do everything you say. So the man takes the mule home and pins him up for the night. The next morning, he storms back to this farmer and he's enraged and he complains, "This mule is worthless. They won't do anything that I say." So the farmer says, "Okay, well, let's go back to your farm and see what the problem is." So they go back, and after a couple of minutes, the farmer looks around and he spots a 2x4 and he picks it up. And he rears back and he whacks the mule on the side of the head, just like he'd hit a baseball. And the man says, "My God, what in the world are you doing to that mule? How's that going to get him to pull a plow?" And the farmer says, "Well, it won't exactly, but first you have to get his attention." And isn't that how we use dissent sometimes to get people's undivided attention? We hit them upside the head, figuratively to be sure, with hard truth. And isn't that what people sometimes must do with us to get our attention, whether it's a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a friend, an employee, a parent, a coworker? When your parents use your whole first name, that's getting your attention. That's whacking you upside the head because they don't have your attention. And dissent can get your attention, can get the attention of the people you lead, the people you want to lead. I think that's exactly what Senator George McGovern, did in 1970 when he waged a powerful condemnation of Washington's collective misrule regarding the Vietnam War. McGovern was a war hero, a World War II bomber pilot, and a highly decorated war hero at that. And some of you may recall that he was the Democratic Party's nominee for president in 1972. But before that, a couple of years before that, in 1970, he went to the Senate floor and he spoke these words: "Every senator in this chamber is partly responsible for sending 50,000 young Americans to an early grave. This chamber reeks of blood. Every senator here is partly responsible for the human wreckage at Walter Reed and Bethesda Naval Hospitals and all across our land, young men without legs or arms or genitals or faces or hopes." He continued, "There are not many of these blasted and broken boys who think this war is a glorious adventure. Don't talk to them about bugging out or national honor or courage. It does not take any courage at all for a congressman or a senator or a president to wrap himself in the flag and say, we're staying in Vietnam, because it's not our blood that's being shed, but we are responsible for those young men and their lives and their hopes." Many years later, when I was working on my book on the Vietnam War, I went to see Senator McGovern and interviewed him for the book, and I asked him specifically about that speech. And he told me that after he was done with speaking, as he was walking off the Senate floor, a colleague, he couldn't remember who it was, came up to him on the floor and said, "George, that speech really offended me." And McGovern said, "Good, that's what I wanted to do." That was hitting his colleagues upside the head with that figurative 2x4. Let me say it again. Conflict and truth aren't enemies, they're allies. Conflict prompts people to think. It can force a conversation. It can force a creative response. Truth opens eyes. It makes people mad. And even when it's difficult and wrapped in conflict, it can also inspire confidence and credibility. I want to repeat Peter Drucker. Truth begins a process in which we can synthesize dissenting views and in the end into consensus and commitment. And telling the truth doesn't always mean dissent. Let's just make that clear. It sometimes can be praise. But if you have a reputation for telling the truth, your praise becomes more meaningful and powerful. Conflict and truth aren't enemies, they're allies. Jesus, Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony. Why are all these and other great leaders considered so great? I think it's because they told the truth. Jesus recorded as saying the words, "I tell you the truth," 78 times in the New Testament. And speaking of telling the truth, Martin Luther King, at one of his darkest hours in a Birmingham jail in 1963, thought that the clergymen, they were all men, of Birmingham, white and black, needed to hear the hard, unvarnished truth about the way they were leading their congregations and the way they were influencing their community. And what he ended up teaching them in his letter was a lesson about the necessity of dissent, of telling the truth in pursuit of progress and justice. And I want to share with you just a part of what King wrote in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, something that I sit down every year and read in January on Martin Luther King Day, because I regard it as American scripture. And I think this passage is worth hearing tonight. King wrote, "You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins and marches and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such tension that a community which is constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored." And so King was a big fan of what he called creative tension, creative nonviolence, and he believed that truth and conflict were not enemies, they're allies. So King wrote toward the end of that letter, he said, "So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for love or for hate? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice?" So here's my humble suggestion for you. How might we find a way to strengthen our organizations by not simply tolerating dissent, but by encouraging it, or maybe even better, by institutionalizing it. And here's my humble suggestion to you that's taken from the conclusion of my book on wartime dissent. It's food for thought. I would love to hear some of you react to this. But I had this crazy idea about how we might as a nation use dissent to stop us from getting into wars that we shouldn't be getting ourselves into. I was thinking about this particularly when we were embroiled in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But I think this could apply to other areas of our public life and in our own organizations. In 1708, the Pope at the time established an office that he called Promoter of the Faith. It's a position within the church that deals with the canonization, creating saints. The position also became known as the Devil's Advocate. That may be the term that many of you know. That's where the term Devil's Advocate came from, and it's described like this by the Catholic Encyclopedia. No important act in the process of canonization is valid unless performed in the presence of the promoter of the faith, or the Devil's Advocate. His duty is to protest against the omission of forms laid down and to insist upon the consideration of any objection. In other words, the promoter of the faith, the Devil's Advocate, in the process of creating a saint of the church, is to try to prove the person really wasn't a saint. Because the call to war comes to us in religious and righteous tones, and it's so easy to get wrapped up, and the country gets whipped up into a frenzy, and we're all marching in the same direction. I wrote that maybe we need Congress, the country needs an official Devil's Advocate in moments of war, when we're about to go to war. And so this is what I wrote. I therefore suggest that Congress might consider creating a committee or a commission whose sole responsibility would be to investigate and argue with perhaps a formal report against any formal war declaration or use of force resolution. Members would be forced to put any decision about war to the most rigorous test, and to ensure that their colleagues and their constituents are fully informed about any decision regarding war. The committee's chair would be given time to make a formal presentation to the Congress, and hopefully it would be on national and primetime national television, so that the whole country would hear. It will ensure that Congress will not go to war without hearing a sober presentation of the reasons for delaying or preventing war. Now, my point in sharing that with you is to challenge us to all think about ways that we might institutionalize dissent into our organizations. I don't mean that we need a Devil's Advocate committee for every little decision we might make, but on the big ones, what might we learn if we had someone in our organization whose only job it was on this decision was to do his or her best to try to shoot it down, to make the case against it? Are we bold enough to try something like that? And if we did, what mistakes might we avoid? What opportunities could we uncover? What trust would we create? And I think that the trust part is really undervalued. The trust that's created in an organization by institutionalizing and encouraging dissent is enormous. What creative consensus might we reach if we didn't just tolerate dissent, but we actively encouraged it? I'm going to quote Peter Drucker again. He said, all the first-rate decision makers I've observed had a very simple rule. If you have a quick consensus on an important matter, don't make the decision. Acclamation means that nobody has done the homework. What Drucker meant is that if a decision is important and risky, it should be controversial. I think that Drucker also meant that we need to surround ourselves with people who are not afraid, who really are empowered to tell us the truth. I know that most of you aren't at the point of your careers where you're hiring people for an organization, but you are leaders in various organizations, and you are making decisions, and soon enough you're going to be running organizations or businesses. And may I suggest that you try just hitting the pause button when you and your team all agree on some major course of action or some momentous decision. Consider training yourself to see unanimity not as an affirmation of a great idea, but as the absence of sober, wise dissent, as a warning sign that maybe you've not done all your homework. Consider maybe assigning someone to do nothing other then identify the problems with the decision, or maybe even assign someone to argue vigorously against it in a formal way. In the end, you may not change your mind about the decision, but it might help you make important course corrections. You might save yourself some embarrassment. And at the very least, you're going to have taken time to test your plans or ideas against a vigorous argument against them. And let me digress for just a second to point out that we are all better at arguing for a cause after we've taken time to understand the case against that cause. There's a story about President Harry Truman right after he took office in 1945, after President Roosevelt died. And his good friend Sam Rayburn, the House Speaker, the legendary House Speaker, went down to the White House to see him shortly after he took office. And Rayburn told him, he said, "Harry, this will be the last time that I'm going to address you in such an informal manner by calling you by your first name. I'm going to call you Mr. President from here on out, because that's the way I think our relationship ought to be. But there's one other thing I want to say. While you're President of the United States, you're going to have a staff around you that's going to tell you day in and day out that you're the smartest man in the world, and that's going to have a real effect on you. But the truth is, Mr. President, you and I both know it's a damn lie." So I'll leave you tonight with these questions. What kind of people do you have around you? What kind of people do you want around you? Do you want the kind of people who are going to endorse your decisions, or do you want the people who tell you hard, sometimes uncomfortable truth? Are you willing to empower them to play devil's advocate? Do we trust the people that we lead to encourage them to tell us truths, to speak those truths to the entire organization? Are we secure enough in our leadership to recognize and embrace those hard truths that these individuals might tell us? And that the answer to those questions will tell us a lot about our leadership. Thank you for your attention, and I would love to respond to any questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mann. Everyone, if you would join me in a round of applause. I know you can't, he might not be able to hear you, but if you can at least show him some grace and appreciation for being with us tonight. As he said, it is probably now 2:30 a.m. in Tel Aviv, so we definitely appreciate you being here. I can actually remember meeting Dr. Mann years ago. He and I have worked at LSU. I started in 2000 and then came to Phi Kappa Phi in 2019, and he had advised many student organizations, one of which was a political communications group, and so they have been very good at what they do, and I've enjoyed watching them. So now we're going to take some questions. So if you have a question, please go to your reactions and raise your hand, and I will recognize you and ask you to unmute. If you don't have a question right away, maybe you'll think of something. Oh, looks like we do have a question. So Yash, if you will unmute and ask your question. Okay, maybe he lowered his hand. So while we're waiting, oh, here's another one. So Eric Dillon, would you please ask your question?
Hi, I just had a question about how you go about making a change in your organization or your group or whatever it is when it feels like you're the only one willing to dissent and you just feel all alone, and it's just not good if you dissent, but you really want to.
Wow, that's a very good question. That's an excellent question. And you know, I'll say this, that's the unless you're in an organization that encourages dissent, what you've described is the way that every dissenter from time immemorial has felt, alone. So first of all, if you've done that, if you've been willing to speak out, and you're this lonely voice in your organization or on your campus willing to speak out, bravo to you, because that takes an enormous amount of courage to do something like that. So that says a lot about that already. I think affirms your character, that affirms your leadership abilities right there. The thing is that you can only control how you respond to that situation by speaking out. You can't control others. You can hope to influence others. You can hope to inspire others. What I would say is that it's very easy to get discouraged. You will have people tell you, don't do it. But, I'm not trying to brag on myself or anything, because I'm not, I haven't really particularly risked I have tenure. So I wasn't particularly risking a lot. But I did have a lot of people come tell me that I needed to stop. You know, I was attacking the governor. I called on my board of supervisors to resign, and people told me to stop. That I was harming the organization, and I think it's moments like that where you have to be true to yourself. You have to listen to yourself. And I'm not saying don't listen to others, because that would kind of be a violation of what I've just spent the last 30 minutes talking about. But when I'm talking about at a deeper level, when you have made the decision to speak out, and when you're the only one, that tells you, and that tells me that you've given it a lot of thought, that you're very convicted about this. And you need to know before you do it that people are going to try to make you stop. And they're going to throw obstacles in your way. They're going to tell you you're hurting the organization. You're harming the people around you. And all I can say is that's one time when you shouldn't listen. You shouldn't let the dissent in your life influence you, because they will try to stop you. They're going to, and I think you've got to listen to your inner voice at that point. I think you've got to keep listening to that inner voice. And I think that here's a great little story. I'm writing this book about Huey Long. And one thing that Huey Long did that I thought was kind of genius when you think about it, he would go into these towns this is when he's first running for governor in the early 1900s, and nobody really knew who he was around in other parts of Louisiana. So he would go into town, he'd figure out who's the most popular, powerful person in town, and he would go into town, get on the town square, and spend 30 minutes to an hour attacking that person. And then he would go sit in the lobby or the restaurant of the local hotel, and all that person's enemies would come to him, and he would figure out he would get the opponents of that person to come to him. That's how he kind of flushed them out. But what the genius of that was that he had the courage to speak out, and he found allies by speaking out. He found allies. So when you do that, you think you're going to you think no one supports you, but they do. They're as afraid as you were 2 days before you spoke out. They're afraid of the consequences too. So what I would say is keep doing it, because eventually those allies will come to you. Eventually you will inspire other people to speak out. So don't give up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question, Eric. Do we have any other questions? I see Nicholas McKenna. Nico, please unmute yourself.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for. I found your talk very insightful.
Thank you.
So, I just also had a bit of a sort of weird note on it. I guess I would call it the sort of angel's advocate position. But is there any position you would take where dissent sort of becomes like unnecessary or potentially like conflicting with the truth? Like, is there any position or context you think that would potentially throw some doubt into whether dissent is necessary?
Oh, that's a great question. And I mean, maybe there is, but I think in a democracy, in a pluralistic society, in a country that values conflicting opinions, we value the marketplace of ideas. I don't think so. I mean, I'm pretty committed to the idea that that every idea ought to stand on its own. Even the most objectionable, horrific positions ought to stand on their own. And if they don't, if you do go to the public square, you do speak out, like Eric said a few minutes ago, and no one comes, that may tell you that you're ahead of your time, or that you're wrong, and eventually, I don't know, but I don't think that I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, Nico, but so I'm not trying to assign this to your question, but I don't think that we ought to, at least in the United States, we ought to start saying that here are things that we cannot discuss. Here are opinions that we cannot abide in the public in the public square, because I think they stand on their own. And if they're not popular, if they don't move people, if they don't change the course of the country or the course of the organization, then the consequences will be apparent eventually, maybe, or maybe the inaccuracy of your dissent will eventually be apparent. But the thing is that many dissenters don't end up influencing the course of the country, of the organization. They're only proved right when the decision goes wrong, when everything becomes a disaster. It's cold comfort to people to say, well, if you only listen to me, I was right. But I think we've got to tolerate those opinions. I think we've got to make room for those, even the most objectionable stuff. And let me just, I'm going on too long on this answer, but I want to demonstrate how committed I am to it. I teach a class every semester at LSU in which I encourage my students to create a public affairs campaign. And I tell them, I'm not one of those, I'm not a fan of the NRA. I think we have way too many guns in our society. I think we need more laws to control that. But I tell my students, if you want to put together a campaign to try to persuade LSU to force everybody to carry a gun on campus, for example, I'm very opposed to that. But I will not stop you, and I will help you. I'll help you do that campaign because I believe you have the right to advance your opinions, no matter how unpopular they are. So I believe we've got to make room. We've got to make room for that, because today's dissenters, I really believe this, today's dissenters, today's outcasts, when it comes to public opinion, are really prophets who I think in many cases will be seen as prophets 10, 15, 20, 100 years from now. Well, I think we've got to make room for those people.
So to sort of summarize, do you believe that when dissent is fully institutionalized and supported, it sort of is its own check and balance, because the dissents that aren't strong enough to hold their own will falter without any?
I think so. And the beauty of America, beauty of this country, is that we did institutionalize dissent. I probably should have pointed that out. The party system that so many people are opposed to, they think it's a terrible thing. It is, in some ways it is, right? But it's also an institutionalization of dissent. We've institutionalized dissent. We've created the loyal opposition. Now I think that we've got a party in this country today that's not working as a loyal opposition, and that's why those of us on the other side really want to see the other party sort of regain its sanity and become the loyal opposition. But we've, in this country and in many other democracies, all other democracies, they have institutionalized dissent by creating political parties and giving the opposition, allowing the opposition to have power. And so I think you're right.
All right, that was very insightful. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico.
Okay, we have another question from David Diggs. David, please unmute your mic.
Hello, thank you. I enjoyed the talk very much.
Thank you.
So I was curious, with the polarization that we have in many different arenas, how do you use dissent as a conversation starter instead of a stopper?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think that you've got to, I'll use George McGovern as an example. He went on the Senate floor and he in a sense, he did stop the conversation briefly. I mean, he kind of stunned everybody. But McGovern didn't stop communicating with his allies. He didn't personalize the dissent. It may seem like he personalized it by saying this chamber reeks of blood, but he never named, you, Senator so-and-so, your vote for this cost people's lives. He didn't personalize his dissent. And so I think this is more of a question. I'm not saying you shouldn't personalize your dissent. I mean, if somebody around you is doing something really horrific, you should probably personalize. You should call that person out. But in most organizations, that's not what's happening, right? It's just a bad decision. You're dissenting, and so I think we've got to be careful not to leave people room to move in your direction. And when you start attacking people personally, that's never going to happen because you personalize your dissent. So I think it's important to keep it about the goals of the organization, the institution, remind people of the values and how we're not living up to the values. So, the most effective people in Congress, the most effective dissenters in Congress, the people who really ended up getting legislation passed were people who kept the lines of communication open with their colleagues, even when they were in opposition. They kept their friendships. They found it, maybe I can't work with you on the Vietnam War. Maybe we're totally opposed to this, but there are these other things that we do agree on. We'll work on that. Keeping those lines of communication open, I think, are important. Not personalizing it, I think, is the key. And that's hard to do sometimes. It's really hard to do. And I admit that I have not always followed this advice that I'm giving you. But when I have, I've not been nearly as effective.
Okay. I'm not sure if we still have David on here or not, but thank you, David, from your question. Lisa, if you can unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Dr. Mann. The question that I have, I used to think before going to college, I was almost sure that a good leader was always the one that will hear or will take decisions according to the majority. But then I started to change and I started to think that, well, there is a minority that has a voice and you have to listen to them. But I would like to hear from you, like a suggestion as leaders, how to get a good balance about majority or minority, how to take the best decisions.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. And it's that, I think it goes back to what Drucker said. It's not about necessarily even embracing the dissent. Like if you're the leader and you hear a dissenting voice, you may disagree with it. You may think it's wrong. I think the key is not dismissing it out of hand and finding a way to bring that voice in and synthesize it into the other voices, the other opinions, and have faith in the process. Have faith that if I allow that decision, if I encourage as you put it, the minority to speak and to be heard, that something good will come out of this. And to be comfortable that, because I think what happens, a lot of leaders, I've seen this in politics, is that it's interesting how the leader has decided what he or she wants to do and is not looking to synthesize, is not looking to improve the decision, not looking to test the decision, but is looking for affirmation of the decision. So the meetings that you have sometimes are really sort of like kabuki theater. They're not real meetings. It's just performative kind of discussion. So I think you've got to be committed to that. Maybe I was really determined to move forward on this week, but I'm going to stop and pause and let the discussion take place. And number two, I think it's important not to dominate the discussion, but to be confident enough in your leadership to step back a little bit, sit back and listen, encourage a debate, encourage the people around you to sort of fight it out and not enter into that discussion, to use that to listen. And maybe you be the one at the end who sort of synthesizes all of this, restates this, and tries to put it all together into something that everybody can accept. But I think it's important not to try to be too heavy-handed in this, and to be able to sit back and let that debate go on. Let me just say, a lot of the leaders that I've observed are not comfortable with that, because that to them seems like weakness. Like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be running this organization. I'm supposed to be telling people what to do. I'm supposed to be, setting the goals, being the leader. But sometimes leadership is sitting back and letting this process, this dissent, this discussion, these conflicting ideas play out in front of you. That's very hard for some people, some of these type A people to do. And I think it's something that you have to learn to do. It just does not come naturally. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mann.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from Yash. So Yash, if you will unmute.
Thank you, Dr. Albert Mann, for this very inspiring speech and reflective speech, because I felt like there were so many points where I had to think and recheck my own concepts. My question for you was, you said truth and trust. How does one inculcate trust when individual truths might differ? If someone believes that their belief in religion or something goes against their leaders' thoughts or religion or principles, how does one build trust in those situations when they are on completely different pages on a myriad of topics?
Yes, thank you for that. I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. Could you restate that part? I want to make sure I address it
So how does one navigate when your team has members who have different beliefs to what you think is the correct thing?
Okay. Well, I think you've just got to be. I think that leaders, and when I say leaders, I mean usually the people running the organ, who are sort of seen as the people running the organization, who people normally think as being the decision makers. You have to be comfortable with the fact that maybe you're not right. You know, you've got to be comfortable with the fact that maybe you're going to be, be forced. Maybe "be forced" is the wrong word, but this discussion is going to end with you doing a U-turn, and you're going to think that you're being weak. But I think that it's becoming comfortable with that perceived weakness and understanding that that is really strength. It is just not what our society regards as strength. It just isn't. It is not what your average type A personality in business school regards as strength. It's not what we teach in almost any aspect of our society. But it is strength. And I think it takes a lot of intestinal fortitude and a lot of commitment to that principle to say that I'm going to encourage that, because not only does it lead to better decisions, but people, you mentioned the word trust in the beginning of your question. And I think that's the part that's important, because to the outside world, maybe people think, well, this guy's weak. He's always changing his mind. Or he's always, he starts out here and he goes there. But your organization, the people that you're leading in your organization will not think that about you. That is trust. They're going to be devoted to you because you empower them to participate in the leadership of the organization. You give them not just a perfunctory role, but you give them a real role in running the organization, and talk about a way to inspire trust. I mean, that's what happens. And so it's not only going to create better decisions, but it's going to create an organization where people don't want to leave. They're not going to be lured away. Your good people aren't going to leave for more money because they know that money may help them buy a nicer car, but they're going to be miserable in their jobs because they're going to be working for a boss who doesn't value their opinions. I stayed in my job for Senator Breaux for 17 years, which is a long time for a congressional aide. But I stayed there because he inspired me. He valued my opinions. He made me a real part of his organization. He listened to me. And when I disagreed with him, he maybe didn't always change his mind, but he listened. And it felt like I was collaborating with him. And so I think that, one of the big problems in a lot of organizations today is turnover. You're always losing good people. You're always having to retrain new people. And so I think when it comes to retention, and I speak of this on a university campus, faculty retention in the executive, in the business world, I think this is a key to retention that a lot of leaders don't understand and forget about. So thanks for the question, Yash. I hope that answered it.
Okay, so our next question is from Peter Beltran. So Peter, please unmute yourself. And if we don't hear from him, I'll go to the next person.
Peter's talking, but he...
Oh, okay. How's that?
That's great.
Okay, I'm sorry. I actually have a number of comments, and I'm going to go in reverse order because I think that actually answers things better. This is in response to Yash's question. Our American culture tends to elevate and put more belief in the type A personality. We see that exemplification of strength, and we just want to naturally go with that. Yeah, that's going to be the way to go. But we don't often understand, as our book points out early on, that the best leadership often is predicated upon a person that is willing to admit, A, they don't have all the answers, and B, that maybe they did something that's wrong, that they have to acknowledge and give account to, and ask for forgiveness from the other members. My second point, which was my fifth, this is in reference to you.
So Peter, you need to ask a question because we do have about 5 minutes
Do you agree
less.
with that? Yeah, you agree with anything I'm saying. Regarding the reference to faith and progress, I really, that resonates with me because from how worried I was about the presidential campaign and where it was going and the election and everything, we started to see early on our democratic institutions doing what they were intended to do. Okay, and this was like the courts making rulings on his lawsuits, Trump's lawsuits and stuff. So yes, we have to have faith in our progress. I believe that our government, our four founders really wrote a tremendous constitution. They built a lot of strengths in it, and we have to continue to have faith in that. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yes, I do. I mean, obviously, I do agree with that. It's very, very well stated. I want to go back to something you said, Peter, about forgiveness. That's also a way of creating trust. And one of the things that I wrote the memoir that's coming out, and it actually is coming out in August. I think when I first told Michelle about it, it was coming out in the fall, but it's coming out August 9th. But in my memoir, I devote a lot of time. I realized that I devoted a lot of time to the instances when I went to people and asked forgiveness for something I had done. And I think that's really, I think it's just good in life. I'm not talking about, let's just put leadership aside. I think it's really good in life to be willing to to admit to the people around you that you screwed up, you've hurt them in some way, and ask for forgiveness. I think that's another sign of strength. I don't think it's a sign of weakness. It seems like a sign of weakness. I messed up. Politicians especially try to spin it. No, I didn't make that mistake. I really meant this. I was really doing that. Sometimes the best thing to do is just stop and say, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I did this wrong thing. I'm sorry that I hurt you. That builds trust in any kind of relationship. I mean, there's no relationship that can survive if one person in it is never admitting his or her culpability in bad decisions or admitting mistakes. I think we've got to always in life, I'm not talking about leadership of an organization. I'm just talking about just being a decent person if anybody's going to follow you, they've got to think you're a decent person, I think, and decent people apologize and try to make amends. So thank you for putting that in there. I think that's really, really important.
Well, if I could just prevail a couple minutes more.
I'm actually going to mute Peter right now and move on to Bryn Barkus. She's had her hand up for quite a while. I think we're probably going to have one more person after that. So I'm going to give you all his email address. It's Bob Mann, BOBMANN @lsu.edu. So you can email him if you do not get a chance to ask your question. So Bryn, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, yes. First of all, I wanted to thank you as well for calling and talking to us when it's almost 3 o'clock in the morning there. My question was, do you believe that when would you say is a good time to sort of end that discussion, especially if the question needs to be answered? Because I feel like there's a lot of discussions that can just never end if you're not careful.
Sir, I think you may be muted.
Can you hear me? Oh,
Dr. Mann, you're muted.
I didn't
just
touch
unmuted you.
anything. Am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Okay. So first of all, that's an excellent question, Bryn. When's the time to make the decision? But before I answer that, I don't want to forget to say this. I would love to hear from you, and thank you for sharing my email, Michelle. As and for the next couple of days, I'm going to be traveling, so maybe bear with me. I'm going to be traveling and then severely jet lagged for a few days. If I don't get back to you right away, please don't think I've ignored your email. I'll try to get to it as soon as I can. And but the question that Bryn asked, I think, is a really good one. The decision's got to eventually, somebody, if you're the leader, you've eventually got to take responsibility for, if people are looking to you. Your job is not to conduct an endless free-for-all. Your job is to be the kind of leader that hears all the competing voices, encourages those competing voices to speak out, and synthesizes those competing voices into something that either can be accepted by everybody or creates a better decision than maybe what you were thinking of as starting out. You've also got to be willing to do course corrections. I mean, I lead students in creating communications plans for their organizations every semester. And one important part of it that I always tell my students is constant evaluation, course corrections. How's it going? So once the decision is made, that doesn't mean that, okay, we never look back, we never correct course. you've constantly got to be doing that, because it's a process. It's not just a point in history. It's a process where you're constantly deciding whether we're making the right decision, not whether we made, once the decision was made and you're moving in that direction, that doesn't mean that it can't be changed, and it should be changed. So it's a process, but there has to be a point when we make the decision. Bill Clinton, when he was president, was drove his staff crazy and drove the people around him crazy for having these bull sessions all night long, and he would never make a decision. And I think that was the kind of, he encouraged that dissent around him. But the problem is that he didn't really synthesize it into the decision, or at least do it in a way that I think satisfied the need for a decision eventually. So you're so right. You've got to. I think that's where the leader has to say, okay, everybody's had their voice, and I appreciate that, and I encourage you to continue commenting on this. But here's where we're going. This is what we're going to do. You at some point you got to earn your pay by making that decision. I'm not saying don't make the decision. I'm not saying just endlessly indulge the dissent, but I'm saying that it really is important to encourage that dissent, because it makes better decisions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mann. We are running out of time tonight, and I have a couple reminders for the students. So I just wanted to say thank you for joining us from Tel Aviv. I think we all appreciate it, and I know you're going to get lots of questions. And I see some hands clapping reactions in the Zoom. So thank you so much, and I'm sure they will be in touch.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being with you all.
Thank you. All right, you guys, so we have a couple things for you. So before you go tonight, we have a short poll for you to answer. So Jamie is going to pull that up for us right now. Please respond so you receive credit for attending tonight's keynote address. And we have...
So your question: as a result of participating in this session, I understand how truth and conflict can be allies in leadership.
And when we see that 57 or so have, I think it's 51, looks like everybody is. There we go. About 25 more seconds. All right. Looks like everybody is that has responded. So
thanks, everyone.
All right, so last things, if you have not completed your Clifton Strengths Top 5 assessment, please go ahead and take care of that and email me your results, and that will be the Strengths Insight Report. There's a code in the back of that book that you all received in your box, so please look at the code. There should be a link on there as well for you to use, and then you'll need to click on the Redeem Code button when you get to that website. It should also ask you to set up an account with your email address. That way you can go back and forth and download other reports if you decide you want to get all 34 of the strengths in order. And if you have questions about that, I can answer them later. So one of the other things to note, if you haven't done your top 5 in pictures or your strength slogans, those are going to be due for your small group meeting tomorrow night. You don't have to email me your responses to that. That is your homework to discuss in the small group. If you have already, that's fine, but that's not necessary to do from now. If you I also put a summary of the 34 Clifton strengths in their definitions for each in the Dropbox, so you should see it there. If you have any questions about tomorrow, just send me an email and I will respond as soon as I can. And we'll see you tomorrow for our session on building your Phi Kappa Phi network. So thank you for being here. Good night, everyone.